So we're going to start today talking about the central nervous system, and this is actually the largest unit because, like the nervous system, because it takes up half of that course, half of AP1. Central, peripheral, special senses. That's 3 out of 6 units. Okay, it's practically a quarter of the entire AP1, AP2 course. And I'm going to give you some kind of introductory remarks on the basic principles of organization of the nervous system. And then among the topics that we're going to cover today, what I plan to do, big ones. So we're going to talk about the synaptic transmission, different types of synapses. Quickly cover neurotransmitters. I'm going to spend a lot of time on action potential and neuronal and axonal transmission. And along with that, we're going to touch up on some other minor concepts that accompany those ideas. But first, let's classify, do some classification of the nervous system. So, nervous system, which function is obviously communication of signals and integration of signals and generation of responses, can be anatomically classified, into central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. So this is anatomical classification. Central nervous system includes 3 parts. Brain. And I'm going to give a very quick, what does brain do? Conscious responses. Not only we're gonna see that there are some parts of the brain of which you have no actual conscious awareness. You don't really know what they do, but brain is mostly your conscious responses, like your voluntary movements, skeletal movements, your thoughts, your conscious appreciation of sensations. For instance, the mere fact that you not only hear me, but you know that it's me speaking, the same guy that was here on Tuesday, and you understand what I'm saying. That's all brain. Then you have brain stem. Visceral activities. So for instance, your appetite, your thirst, your heart rate in response to stress, your sexual arousal, things that you can't consciously control, all happen here. Okay, so massive amount of visceral controls are here. And then we have spinal cord. Spinal cord plays 2 main roles. It's a communication pathway to and from the brain stem and the brain, as well as some of the reflexes, automatic activities. It can be reflexes that involve movement or reflexes that involve organs. For instance, your micturition reflex, the peeing reflex, is wired up in the spinal cord. Make sense so far? Parts of the peripheral nervous system are nerves and sensory receptors. So basically, if you look at Benjamin, the central nervous system is completely contained in the skull and in the spinal cord, in the vertebral column. Does that make sense? Once you get out of the vertebral column, that's it. That's a peripheral nervous system. We good so far? Questions? No? Okay. Now, another way to classify nervous system is functional. So you can say that nervous system has the motor part and the sensory part. That makes sense, right? Good? And actually, we're going to go back to this, but all the motor fibers, let's call them fibers, called efferent, and the sensory fibers are afferent. Okay, so you can try to remember this. The motor responses, they result in some kind of an effect. When you experience affect, you experience something, you experience sensation. Good? Okay. Finally, the third approach. Nervous system, the responses of the nervous system and sensations can be somatic and autonomic. So somatic portion here refers refers to the responses that are mediated by your skeletal muscles and therefore often can be consciously controlled. Are you following me? And to the sensations that come from your body, sensations that you can consciously appreciate. Autonomic nervous system refers to the responses that you have no control over. Okay, like your digestive activities or dilation and constriction of the blood vessels. Any questions on this one?
Wait, can you say that again? You said
So somatic is skeletal muscles, things that you can... Okay, if I touch a hot stove with my hand, I'm going to pull my hand back. This response is mediated by my skeletal muscles. Although it is a reflex, but I have a choice. If I know that it's hot and I touch it, I can keep it on. It will require an effort, but I can keep it on. Does that make sense? Yeah. In autonomic responses, you have no control. If your brainstem, if your medulla tells your salivary glands to start salivating when you see a food, you cannot not salivate. You see the difference? Now, all of this I want to summarize in a fairly straightforward but still fundamental concept of how signal travels through the nervous system. So if you think about it, it all starts with some kind of a stimulus, of an impulse. Stimulus, whatever it is, it can be a heat from the stove, or it can be a smell of food in the air, right? Does that make sense? But that stimulus must be sensed. So you've got receptors. Okay? For instance, you know that the stove is hot because you have thermoreceptors in your skin, and you know that food smells good because you have olfactory epithelium in your nose. Okay? And you know that it's food. Receptors transmit the signal via afferent fibers. And the signals arrive to the CNS. And I deliberately am being kind of a vague. On which part of the CNS? If it's salivation, it's going to be brain stem. If you decide to keep your hand on the stove, this is brain. CNS produces a response. So, salivation or holding your hand. And this response via efferent fibers reaches what we call effectors. Okay? Now, what can be, so what are the main types of the effectors for the nervous system? Let me change the hot stove into something different. So imagine I take my keys and I throw them at Tyrone, okay? What's going to be your response? You're either trying to catch or trying to dodge. But you're going to be moving. Which organs are moving you?
Your muscles.
Muscles. So that's effector number one, any kind of muscle. Skeletal, cardiac, smooth, doesn't matter. It's all effectors of the nervous system. So we've got muscles. I bring really good, I don't know, crawfish. Like a pot of crawfish here. What you going to start doing? Salivating. So that's a secretion. Which organs secrete? How do we call organs that secrete something? Glands. That's the second effector. That's it. Does that make sense? That's it. Muscles and glands. Those are two effectors of the nervous system. Which muscles? Which glands? Separate story. If, again, remember what we talked about here. So for instance, can you control any of your glands? Can you control your salivation or? No. So all the glands will be effectors of autonomic nervous system. Can you control consciously your heart? No, so also autonomic. Can you control your gut? No, also autonomic. The only thing you can control actually is skeletal muscles. So basically, skeletal muscles are the only effectors of the somatic branch. Does that make sense? Now, I want to highlight this. These three classifications, they aren't opposite to each other. They aren't mutually exclusive. We're just talking about different aspects. We look at the nervous system from the different angle. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, one thing that I really want to keep on the board for now. Look at the route of the signal. It always goes, first of all, the receptors, they are in the periphery, right? They are outside of your CNS. So the signal will always go from the periphery, from the receptors, through the afferent fibers to the CNS, which will formulate the response, and response will go through the efferent fibers to the periphery again, to the muscles. And this will always be unidirectional pathway. It can never go back. The actual signal, like the electrical signal that runs through neurons, always goes one way. And basically, my goal today is to help you understand why. Like what is the mechanism? What are the cellular determinants that don't allow this signal to go in random direction and always go in one? Good? Okay. Now we're going to be switching gears a little bit, and we're going to be talking about the cells of the nervous system. I'm going to lift it, if you don't mind, so I can at least see the image. So, what you need to know. Very basic stuff. There are 4 glial cells. So, glia. 4 types of glial cells in the CNS, and 4 types of glial cells in the PNS. In the CNS, astrocytes, I'm going to put very vague terms support and blood-brain barrier. So when I say support, it's not like physical support, although to some extent it is. Astrocytes in the central nervous system, they make sure that the environment, the extracellular fluid, is balanced, like all the nutrients are there, all the ions are properly balanced, and so forth. We good so far? Microglial cells. Protection against pathogens. Oligodendrocytes. Now, certain things I'm going to be mentioning without really highlighting them, but you should remember them. So signal that goes through the neurons is electrical. Have you seen wires in your house? Are they insulated? Do they have insulation on them, the plastic insulation?
Oh,
Of course. That's electrical insulation cells. And finally, ependymal cells that will not appear in our sort of field of interest until next Tuesday. For sure, they make cerebrospinal fluid. We're going to talk about them again next week. Questions? Go ahead.
The BBB again?
Blood-brain barrier, and thank you for the question. This is one of the fundamental features. It's actually worth saying a few words about it. Brain is one of your most valuable organs. Everybody agrees with that? Like, you can't live without it, although when I drive to 71, it looks like a lot of people live without it. Please drive without it. So you want to, and your blood can carry a lot of different stuff. Toxins, microorganisms, whatever. So, in order to protect your brain from whatever's in the blood, astrocytes, together with the cells, epithelial cells in the blood vessels, they form almost impermeable barrier that allows only the passage of nutrients and gases from blood to the brain and back. And that's great because things like viruses and bacteria and toxins have really hard time getting through. The downside of it, if you want to treat a brain disease, you need to break that barrier. Does that make sense? Because drugs cannot cross it simply. And that's a huge pharmaceutical, I wouldn't say problem, it's an issue that has to be resolved every time the brain drug is developed. Good? Okay, awesome. PNS. Now, I sometimes forget to ask if I answered your question. So if you feel like I haven't, let me know, okay? PNS. So we've got satellite cells. They're like astrocytes, all kinds of support. Mostly like nutritional and balance of ions. And then you have Schwann cells. This is electrical insulation cells. Now you may ask, why do we need two different types? Honestly, I have no idea. But they are different. Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes have different physiological properties. And we're going to learn about it basically first thing in PNS. When we move to Unit 3, we'll learn about some differences between those two. Clear? Know this stuff. Next topic on the agenda, a neuron. So what do you need to know about the neuron structure? Central part of the neuron is the body, or also known as soma. Okay? Now, neuron, any neuron, will be receiving signals. Okay? And the reception part is up to dendrites. So those are branch-like extensions from the surface of the soma. This is where the signal comes in. Clear? And then all different signals. So dendrites receive the signal. Then those signals are integrated on the body or soma. And the resulting integrated signal is conveyed down the road via axon. Okay? So far we good?
Did this take place when? You said this take place when neurons?
No. It's like how the signal is transmitted.
Oh.
So it's just the order. So you take any neuron, it will receive the signal on the dendrites, it will integrate the signal on the body, and it will send the signal downstream through the axon to other neurons.
Okay.
Couple of smaller bits. So this part specifically, where the final integration of the signal occurs, it's called axonal hillock. These branches at the end, called axonal terminals. And now I want to introduce another thing, because so there's going to be one bit today, but there will be very, very little clinical connection, honestly. But in most cases, I will try to provide some clinical relevance of what we're talking about. So electrical insulation, right? Oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells, what they do, they extend the cytoplasm. Like they produce like long extensions of the cell. And these extensions, full of the protein called myelin, they wrap the axon basically. Does that make sense? We often call it a myelin sheath. Right? So this is something I'm going to bring back that analogy later, but you all have seen power lines, right? And you all have seen cables like that go over the road, like the smaller ones, the ones that go to the house. So cables that go to the house, they're all insulated. The reason for it, if they accidentally get caught and they fall on the ground, we don't want the electricity to start leaking in the ground, right? This is why all your wires in your house are insulated. You don't want electricity to leak anywhere. Power lines are not insulated because air by itself is a perfect insulation. And the chances that they're going to drop are minimal. Now, insulation of an axon makes the signal travel much faster. We will learn today how. Good? And the disease called multiple sclerosis. Your immune system attacks myelin and destroys myelin sheath. Make sense? And the axons, so basically the wires quote unquote, that were insulated normally suddenly lose that insulation. And the signal either doesn't get transmitted but gets transmitted much slower. These neurons, damaged neurons, are motor ones. The person will experience motor deficits all the way up to paralysis. If those are involved in, I don't know, cognitive function, you're going to have cognitive deficits in the people with multiple sclerosis. That makes sense so far? Kind of why it's important that we talk about this stuff? Good? Okay. Questions? Trying to think what I need to tell. Oh yeah. I'm not going to put this here. So 3 types of neurons. They are on the slides. Multipolar, bipolar, unipolar. What do you need to know? Match a term with the description. So for instance, what is multipolar neuron? There is a description on the slide. It's a neuron with multiple dendrites and a single axon. Okay? Or what is unipolar? The single dendrite and a single axon are fused, and the body is located on the side of the neuron. Like, there is a description. Functionally, multipolar neurons, most numerous, usually involved in cognitive functions, motor functions. Bipolar, heavily involved in the sensory responses, as well as unipolar. Okay? That's all. I'm not going to ask you to draw them and practice that. We good? Questions so far?